There is a time of day when all our achievements seem like paper. It is always in the late afternoon, when the golden light comes through the window and illuminates everything that should make us happy. The diploma on the wall, the photos of the places we visited, the objects we bought with so much effort. Everything there, untouched by time, testifying to our competence, our progress, our successful life. And yet, something creaks inside. It's a strange feeling. As if we've been wearing clothes that aren't ours for so long that we've forgotten what our own skin feels like. As if we were actors playing our own lives, and suddenly, in the middle of the play, we realize that we no longer remember who we were before we stepped onto the stage. Something doesn't fit. Something that should be there isn't. Or something that is there shouldn't be. We look in the mirror and see someone we recognize, but we don't feel like them. We check social media and see our lives told in perfect stories, but inside there's a hollow echo, as if we were screaming in an empty cathedral. We have everything we ever wanted. We do everything we ever dreamed of doing. And yet there is a void that grows in proportion to our success. It's not depression. It's not ingratitude. It's not imposter syndrome or any other term that popular psychology offers as a band-aid. It's something deeper and more frightening. It's the suspicion that maybe the problem isn't having too little, but having achieved exactly what we wanted. What if the emptiness isn't a bug but a feature? What if this feeling of disconnection isn't a detour but the inevitable destination of those who followed the map that civilization gave us? There is a philosopher who understood this 300 years before us. Someone who looked at human progress and said, wait, what if all this is a mistake? Someone who saw civilization not as the solution, but as the problem itself. Jean-Jacques Rousseau knew that our pain does not come from what we lack, but from what we have gained. And maybe it's time to find out what we lost along the way. Rousseau began with a question that no one had the courage to ask. What if human beings were not born corrupt? What if in fact we corrupted ourselves along the way? It was 1750, and all of Europe was celebrating the enlightenment of reason, the progress of the arts, the refinement of customs. Paris was buzzing with literary salons, scientific discoveries, revolutions in thought. It was the age of enlightenment, and everyone felt very enlightened. Rousseau looked at all this and felt nauseous. It wasn't misanthropy. It was something much worse. It was clarity. He saw men and women behaving like characters in a play even when they were alone. He saw people who no longer knew what they really wanted, because they had learned to want only what was appropriate to want. He saw an entire society chasing goals that others had set for them, competing for prizes that others had created, measuring their worth by standards that others had drawn up. And then Rousseau did something revolutionary. He imagined what a human being would be like before all that. Not a savage in the pejorative sense, not an ignorant primitive, but a human being in their natural state, before society taught them who they should be, before constant comparison poisoned their relationship with themselves, before the fear of judgment became stronger than their inner voice. This natural human being was neither good nor bad. They were simply authentic. They acted on instinct, not calculation. They felt hunger and sought food. He felt sleepy and slept. He felt desire and sought companionship. There was no layer of neurosis in his existence that we call civilization. And most importantly, he did not suffer from comparison. He did not look at others and feel inferior or superior. He did not measure his worth by what he had or did not have. He did not carry the anguish of having to constantly prove that he deserved to exist. Rousseau called this the state of nature, but he wasn't talking about a specific historical period. He was talking about a dimension of human experience that we have all had and lost. Moments when we were simply ourselves, without masks, without performance, without fear. Remember the last time you felt completely at ease? Not performing competence, not proving your worth, not calculating impressions, just being. It was probably a private moment, perhaps alone in nature, or in an intimate conversation where all defenses were down for a few minutes. That feeling is a glimpse of what Rousseau called the natural state. And the reason it is so rare, so precious and so fleeting is that we have built an entire civilization dedicated to separating us from it. With each passing day, we put more layers between ourselves and our original nature. More social rules, more expectations, more correct ways of being, feeling, and existing. And with each layer, the emptiness grows. Because underneath it all, there is still a part of us that remembers what it was like to be real, and that part is suffocating. Rousseau knew exactly when it all went wrong. It was the moment someone looked at a piece of land and said, "This is mine." It wasn't the first word, it wasn't the first tool, it wasn't even the first war. It was the first fence. The first mine that separated the world between what belongs and what is denied. Between those who have and those who don't. Between those who are in and those who are out. Imagine this primitive scene. A group of human beings walking freely through a landscape without borders. They harvest, hunt, and shelter where nature offers protection. There are no owners, no dispossessed. No one is comparing the size of their cave to their neighbors. No one is working 40 years to pay the mortgage on a life that may never be lived. And then, in a moment that changed everything forever, someone stuck a stake in the ground and said, "From here on, it's mine." The most astonishing thing was not that this person had the audacity to do so. The most astonishing thing was that the others believed him, that they accepted that an invisible line could transform land into property, abundance into scarcity, brotherhood into competition, as if a magic word had the power to rewrite reality, to transform what was common into exclusive, what was free into captive. Something was born there that Rousseau called the first foundation of inequality among men. Not a natural inequality, some being stronger or faster, but an artificial invented inequality that created for the first time in human history two categories of people, those who have and those who want to have. And notice how interesting it is. Before that first fence, there was no envy. How can you envy something that no one has? How can you feel inferior for not having something that is simply available to everyone? Envy only arises when there is property. The desire to be someone else only appears when there is comparison. The suffering of not having only exists when someone has decided that having is possible. Rousseau saw that private property was not just a way of organizing resources. It was a way of organizing souls. Because the moment I can have more than you, our relationship ceases to be between equals and becomes one between competitors. And competitors cannot be authentic with each other. Competitors live behind masks. If you stop to pay attention, and please stop, you will notice how this operates in your daily life. How difficult it is to have a genuine conversation when there is a silent dispute over status. How impossible it is to completely relax when there is always someone who can have more, know more, be more than you. How every social encounter becomes a disguised assessment of who is winning in life. Property didn't just bring material goods. It brought ontological anxiety, the permanent feeling that you may not be enough, that you need to prove your worth, that your existence depends on accumulating evidence that you deserve to exist. It brought the neurosis of constantly having to justify why you occupy the space you occupy, why you consume what you consume, why you deserve what you have. And most cruelly, it brought the illusion that the solution to emptiness is to have more. That if you get the next promotion, the next purchase, the next recognition, the feeling of inadequacy will disappear. That the problem is not the system of comparison itself, but only your current position within it. As if it were possible to win a game whose rules guarantee that there will always be someone with more. Rousseau knew this was a lie, not because he was against progress or civilization on principle, but because he understood that a system based on constant comparison cannot produce permanent satisfaction. It can produce temporary victories, dopamine spikes, moments of relief, but it cannot produce peace. Because peace requires the absence of the need to constantly prove something. Because in a world where everything is mine or yours, where every relationship is mediated by the silent question, who has more, authenticity becomes impossible. How are you going to show vulnerability to someone who can use that information against you in the next dispute? How are you going to be spontaneous in a society where every gesture is calculated to impress or compete? And so we surround not only the earth, we surround ourselves. We create internal properties. My image, my career, my identity, my value. And we spend our entire lives defending these imaginary fences, forgetting that we built them ourselves. We live like gods in a prison we designed ourselves. The most tragic thing is that there is still within each of us someone who remembers how it was before the first fence. Someone who knows what it's like to exist without having to prove that they deserve to exist. That person is there, suffocated, but alive, waiting for the day when we stop building walls and remember what it was like to walk free. And perhaps it is that person who suffers the most when we look around and see that we have everything, but we are nothing. The tragedy does not stop at property. In fact, it has barely begun. Because after we invented mine and yours, we needed to teach our children to live in this artificial world. And so was born something that Rousseau considered even more violent than the fence: education. Not education as learning, education as deformation. Rousseau observed something that should keep us awake at night. We take children who are born naturally curious, spontaneous, authentic, and spend years teaching them not to be themselves. We call this preparing them for life. In fact, we are preparing them for death, the death of who they really are. Look at a small child. They don't pretend to like what they don't like. They don't smile when they're sad. They don't talk when they have nothing to say. They don't pretend to be smart when they don't understand. They simply are. They exist in a direct relationship with the world, without mediation, without calculation, without fear of judgment. Their anger is pure, their joy is complete, their curiosity is genuine. Now watch that same child after a few years of education. See how they learn to give the answers adults want to hear, even when they don't believe them. How they develop the ability to hide their true feelings behind appropriate smiles. How they discover that spontaneity is punished and conformity is rewarded. How they learn that there is a right version of themselves that pleases and a wrong version that disturbs. Rousseau wrote an entire book about this, Émile, which is at its core a cry of horror disguised as a pedagogical treatise. He imagined what it would be like to educate a child without corrupting them, without forcing them to be who they are not, without destroying their nature in the name of preparing them for society. It was a desperate thought experiment. Would it still be possible to preserve human authenticity within civilization? And he came to the most disturbing conclusion possible. It is almost impossible, because we live in a society that only works with deformed people. A society that needs individuals willing to compete, to perform, to repress their natural instincts in the name of what we call civilization. A society that needs people who are willing to work 40 years in a profession they hate in order to buy things they don't need to impress people they don't know. Think about your own education. Not just your formal education, but all the informal education you receive simply by growing up among humans. How many times were you taught that your spontaneous feelings were wrong? How many times did you learn that there was a right way to be that had nothing to do with who you naturally were? You were taught that crying was a sign of weakness, that questioning was disrespectful, that spontaneity was immaturity, that authenticity was social inadequacy, that loving was dependence, that trusting was naivety, that being direct was rude, that your natural impulses were inappropriate, and that you needed to learn to control yourself, as if controlling yourself meant denying yourself. Layer by layer, year after year, you learned to build an acceptable personality on top of your real personality. And this was called growth, maturity, development. As if maturing was synonymous with betraying yourself. As if being an adult meant completely losing touch with who you were when you didn't yet know you needed to be someone else. Rousseau knew that this was not development. It was amputation. We were cutting off living parts of ourselves to fit into shapes that others had created. And the cut-off part doesn't disappear. It stays there, buried, aching softly, constantly reminding us of who we could have been. That's why sometimes, in the middle of an important meeting, you feel an inexplicable nostalgia. It's the amputated part reminding you that it exists. The cruelest part is that we do this with love. Well-meaning parents raise well-meaning children to be successful in a society that demands the sacrifice of authenticity. And we call it giving opportunities, preparing for the future, teaching how to live. As if living were synonymous with adapting to a sick world. But Rousseau asked the fundamental question, live like whom? If we spend our entire childhood learning not to be who we are, if we spend our entire adolescence discovering which mask to wear, if we spend our entire adult life competing with other masks, when do we live our own lives? When do we stop acting and start existing? What if education, instead of liberating us, has imprisoned us? What if, instead of teaching us to think, it has taught us only to repeat? What if, instead of preparing us for life, it has prepared us for a life that is not ours? What if we spend decades trying to succeed in an existence we never chose to live? The most frightening thing is that this distortion is so subtle, so gradual, so well-intentioned, that most of us don't even realize it has happened. We wake up at 30, 40, 50, look in the mirror, and don't recognize who is there. Not because we have changed, but because we never discovered who we were before we taught ourselves to be who we should be. And then comes the question that Rousseau did not ask, but which resonates on every page he wrote. Is there still time to go back? Is there still some part of us that has not been educated out of existence? Or is it already too late to find who we were before we learned to be who we are not? And so we arrive at the most painful point of Rousseau's analysis. Once we understand that we have lost our authentic nature, that property has turned us into perpetual competitors, that education has deformed us since childhood, the inevitable question arises. What do we do now? Rousseau knew that we cannot simply return to the state of nature. There is no going back. The fence has already been built. Property has already been invented. Education has already shaped us. We are too civilized to be savages, but too savage to be truly civilized. We are stuck in a middle ground, carrying the memory of what we were and the impossibility of returning to it. That's when he had his most ambitious and tragic idea, the social contract. If we can't be natural, maybe we can be free in a different way. If we have to live in society, maybe we can build a society that preserves our essential freedom. A civilization that doesn't force us to betray ourselves in order to exist. Imagine a society where each person agrees to give up some of their individual freedom in exchange for greater collective freedom, where laws are not imposed from above, but emerge from the general will, where no one obeys another human being, but everyone obeys rules they themselves have created, where authority does not come from force or tradition, but from the genuine consent of all involved. It's a beautiful idea, and completely impossible, because it assumes that people deformed by civilization can suddenly behave as if they were not deformed, that individuals educated to compete can suddenly cooperate genuinely, that human beings accustomed to mass can suddenly be authentic with each other. Rousseau knew this. That is why The Social Contract is at heart a melancholic book. He describes the ideal society knowing that it is unattainable. It is like writing the manual for a machine that will never work, because the parts we have are already broken. And here we come to the heart of modern angst. We know what we have lost. We know that there is something wrong with the way we live. We know that constant competition makes us sick, that performance exhausts us, that the need to constantly prove our worth empties us. But we also know that we cannot simply stop living in this world. We cannot renounce civilization without renouncing everything it has given us. We cannot go back to being authentic children without losing the consciousness that allows us to understand our own deformation. We cannot be simultaneously innocent and conscious, natural and civilized, free and responsible. That is why emptiness persists even when we have everything, because everything is always everything within this system that demands our constant betrayal. Even when we win, we lose. Even when we get what we wanted, we discover that we wanted it with a part of us that is no longer real. Rousseau saw that we are a species in permanent contradiction with itself. We created civilization to protect us from our nature, but our nature is exactly what civilization destroys. We seek happiness through means that make happiness impossible. We pursue freedom through paths that imprison us. And perhaps that is the hardest truth he left us. There is no solution. There is no turning back. There is no point of arrival where we will finally be free and happy and authentic within civilization. There is only the awareness of the contradiction, the clarity about the price we pay, the lucidity about our condition. But there is something powerful in that clarity. Because when we stop looking for the impossible solution, when we accept that we are contradictory beings living in an impossible situation, something changes. Not the situation, that remains the same, but our relationship to it. Perhaps the freedom Rousseau sought was not in resolving the contradiction, but in consciously inhabiting it. Perhaps the authenticity that is possible is not that of the lost state of nature, but that of those who honestly acknowledge their own deformation. Perhaps the only way to be genuine in an artificial society is to admit without pretense that we are artificial. And maybe, just maybe, that admission is the first step toward finding, within the prison of civilization, small spaces where we can still breathe like human beings. Not as the person we should be, not as the person others expect us to be, but as the contradictory, deformed and conscious person we really are. Because in the end, the only revolution possible is the quietest of all, to stop pretending we don't know who we are. Have you ever felt like you were living someone else's life? Write in the comments. If you've made it this far, you've already taken a step beyond most people. You watch the videos. You reflect on each idea. Now the question is, how far do you want to go with this? If you want to take the next step and truly apply this knowledge to your life, the codes of the White Rabbit are ready for you. The link is in the pinned comment. Remember, success is a decision. The choice is yours. Count on me and follow the White Rabbit.